Welcome, Helen. It's such a pleasure to see you here. Um, Helen studied on the MA last year, so she is amazing because she managed to do an MA while writing a book published by Penguin, her second book published by Penguin. So she's an inspiration for all of us. Um, so thank you for joining us. I love this novel, and I'll just should we start with having you read a section of it, and then
Sure.
I will ask you some questions, and then we'll open up the floor.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thanks everybody for tuning in at tea time to hang out with us. I'm just going to read a little bit from the very first chapter, partly because I'm always too scared to read further later in the book in case I see any mistakes. So I'm comfortable with the first chapter. I've checked it many times, more times than anything else. So I always read from there. And for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, it opens in 2005 on a little island off the west coast of Ireland called Inishogue in the novel. And so I'll just read you this little passage that introduces two of the main protagonists from the novel, Murta and Maeve Moon. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, brilliant. So Murta had woken that morning once again to an empty bed. The sheets were cool and unruffled on Maeve's side. He had expected to find her sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in her houndstooth shawl, pale and thin in the darkness before dawn. A tangle of blue-black hair swept across her high forehead like a crow's wet wing, her long matted curls secured in a knot at the nape of her neck with one of her red pencils. He had anticipated how she would start when he appeared in the doorway, how he would ignore, as he always did, the few moments it would take for her dove-grey eyes to turn their focus outward, for the ghost to leave her in his presence. The kettle would hiss and spit on the stove as he stood behind her wicker chair and rubbed warmth back into her arms, his voice jolly as he gently scolded her for lack of sleep and faint nonchalance as to its cause. But Maeve wasn't sitting at the kitchen table, nor was she meditating on the stone step of the back door, drinking milk straight from the glass bottle it was delivered in. She wasn't dozing on the living room sofa, the television on but silent, an empty crystal tumbler tucked inside the pocket of her peacock blue silk dressing gown, the one on which she had painstakingly embroidered a murmuration of starlings in the finest silver thread. Instead, there was an empty space on the banister where her coat should have been hanging. Enough?
I'll keep going. It's so beautiful, Helen. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
So my first question would be, with this novel, it's very much informed by the Irish setting. And obviously your first novel was in London. So why this switch to Ireland, and how did that change your relationship to your writing?
That's so interesting. I mean, I suppose the first time out when I was writing the novel, at that point, of course, like anyone, writing their first book, I was writing a book that I never thought anyone would read necessarily, that I wasn't writing to get published, but was sort of writing to work out how to write a book. And my instincts at the time were to kind of remove any barriers to writing that I could, that would make it harder for me to keep progressing the narrative. So I was living in East London where I set the book, and that just felt like an easy way for me to create the world on the page, because I was so immersed in the sights and the sounds and the culture of where I was going to set it. And it just meant that I had such easy access, to that exterior, while I was trying to recreate it. So it hadn't really been a definite thing of, where am I going to set this novel? But then, of course, when it came around the second time around, it was a totally, everything felt like a much more considered decision, because you're writing a book that, in my case, because I signed up for 2 books with my publisher that I knew was definitely going to be published, and it sort of makes you make much more explicit decisions, I think, about everything, including, where I wanted to set it. And I think maybe especially because I live over here in London, I had been really observing so many societal changes and cultural changes in Ireland since I'd left, and felt so fascinated and immersed in all the changes that were happening. And Ireland was so much on my mind at the time when I started writing this, that it just felt so present to me in terms of my interior world that I couldn't imagine at that point writing a book anywhere else. And I sort of wanted to contribute to that conversation a little bit about the kind of changing Ireland and how much I had seen as change, you know, from when I was growing up into, you know, the present day. So I think it felt like a very definite thing. But it does come with its own insecurities as well about, you know, recreating somewhere that means so much to you, especially when you're not physically there, like I have been with the first book. You know, I was relying so much on my memory of place and kind of sensory memory, which is totally so unreliable. But I really enjoyed it. I think I would have found it harder to write about Ireland while I was in Ireland. It's a strange thing, but having that distance, I think, helped a little bit.
How much was it sort of informed by research, and how much was it informed, because you sprinkle the descriptions with all sorts of cultural metaphors from the 1970s to the present day. I really liked that about it. There was all these sort of celebrities and music and television, and so I was wondering, how much research did you do, and how much did you just remember and sort of, you know, feel that was implicit of the time?
Well, I think what is amazing about you know, setting a book in a time period of your childhood and your adolescence, and you know, for a lot of my adult life I was living in Dublin as well, is that you have such an easily accessible bank of references and resources and memories and, you know, things that stayed with you from your childhood, and really vivid, like, temporal moments, you know, that you use in your writing. So I think for the first draft, I try as much as possible just to keep going and not let myself go down the rabbit hole of too much research. And so sometimes when I'm writing, to give a really basic example, if I know that, say, they're going to you know, that they'll have seen a film in the cinema, I'll write in when they went to see, come back and enter a film here, and just keep going, unless it's, you know, particularly relevant to something that they're going to be talking about, or the idea of the film itself has, you know, triggered something specific in the text. And then I go back and layer in some of those details later on, and I'll kind of, you know, sense check, oh, you know, was that band definitely already on the scene in Dublin at that time? And I mean, for example, in terms of the music, I worked in RT in the radio centre for years before I moved to London, and knew a lot of those guys who had been, you know, playing music in the 70s and Horselips and the Radio From Space. And so they were sort of like real life myths that I had been surrounded by, and had heard them talking so much about, you know, what they considered their halcyon days of their youth, you know, playing in bands in Dublin. So when I was writing those scenes in Dublin, you know, I'd message like Pete Holiday in particular, who has a little cameo in the book, and say to him, okay, so I'm putting the Blades in a gig on Baggot Street in 1978, and I want to have this guy there. You know, could that have happened? It doesn't have to have happened, but could it have happened? So, you know, I go back and kind of verify some of those kind of instinctive things then on the second draft, when I know what's going on, because otherwise you could lose days of your life, in my case, going, oh, you know, what television show might have been playing in the room when they came in, and then you're gone down, you're on YouTube, you're watching a whole series of things you watched when you were 12, you know, that way lies madness. So I only kind of let myself get into all of that later on.
I like it. I like it. I feel like we're getting a real insight on your writing process.
Yeah, I need to basically eliminate all distractions, because I'm so easily distracted. It's, oh my goodness, I'm so easily distracted.
So on that, so you were doing your master's while you were writing this book, and it was about Anne Enright's representations of motherhood. Yeah. So how much did that, obviously this is a book about motherhood and about Ireland and the expectations of mothers in Ireland. So how much did your research sort of inform your writing in that respect?
Oh, like so much. I was thinking about this recently, and it felt a bit like the chicken and the egg thing of, you know, did I get to the Anne Enright dissertation because I was obsessing so much about mothers in literature and in my own work, or did I get to that place in my book because I was reading so much about Anne Enright? You know, it all kind of happened together, and it's one of the most amazing things that came out of doing my master's. I mean, I did it part-time over 2 years, so I took a bit longer with it than a lot of the students who were working really flat out for 1 year to get it all done. But it was an amazing thing to constantly be considering texts outside of what I would have been focused on if I had only been working, you know, on the novel. And I think forcing myself to really take a step back and deconstruct a writer like Anne Enright, who has had such a powerful impact on the way that women are understood and represented in Irish literature, was just so critical, I think, in terms of how I approached developing the mother figure in the book. It was never really a totally explicit thing to me in terms of, I wasn't sitting down and going, oh, I must make sure that the mother is X, Y, and Z, because I've learned from a critical study that was integral. It all became kind of much more blurred in my mind. But it definitely just made me really consider in a very powerful way, what I wanted Maeve as a mother figure to be like, and to kind of continue on that incredible dialogue, Maeve and Enright has had about resurrecting the kind of silenced women's voices from our Irish history. And there's kind of a cultural silence around motherhood and the physical experience of mothering and women's bodies, that has really been absent from our literature for, since time began. And I think Anne Enright was one of the first people to really sort of challenge some of those silences and preconceptions. So it was an incredible thing for me to be like delving into all of that and thinking about it, and getting filled with rage about the church and the state holding hands and the oppression of women in Ireland, and raging about that, and then going back and writing a novel that was set during that time. I mean, I couldn't have really asked for more fertile ground, I think, in terms of helping me just think about what was going to be important to me in the writing of that book. Yeah.
I thought you were so nice on the church, though, because this Father Brunel, he's quite a nice figure, he stands up against the island provincialism at the end, and he's quite open-minded. So I wonder, say something more about your representation of the church.
Yeah. It's so interesting what happened with Father Donal, because I suppose in my non-fiction work, in the journalism I've done, I've been really hard on the church, and have written essays about the oppression of women in Ireland, and really gone for it, and have obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I'm sure it won't surprise anyone to know, have like completely obviously left the kind of church that I was brought up in terms of having a very traditional Catholic upbringing. But I suppose something that I reflected upon a lot when I was writing that book and was really considering about changing attitudes in Ireland is that, there were a whole there was at least one, maybe two generations of people in Ireland who were really grieving their faith. And, and when all the kind of scandals came out in the church, and they were forced to sort of, really reconsider their relationship with the church and with the priest that they had been so part of their lives growing up, and the whole community and the culture, that the church had, it was a lot easier for me, when I was a teenager, to hear about the scandals and, turn my back on the church and decide, that I wanted nothing to do with it, that it was for my mother, who, is in her 80s now and had to suddenly, really in the space of a few years, process the incredible betrayal and how personal it felt for her, that this church that had been so part of her life for her from her childhood straight through to like her later years, how to process that sense of betrayal and how you reconcile that with your faith that goes beyond, the doctrine. And I think I've been really thinking about this, how, how do you do that? How do people in Ireland find a new way, a new spirituality that kind of maybe is separate from the church, but allows them to hang on to the things that were important to them? And I guess Father Donal sort of came out of that, in the sense that, if you ask my mother now how she feels about the church, she said that feels like she's just taken away the kind of ethics that aligned with her values, and she doesn't care about the bricks and mortar element of it anymore. She doesn't go to confession, and she doesn't go to communion or do any of those things, but she's just held on to the things that really matter to her. And I suppose Father Donal, for me, became a kind of a symbol for how you could he could be someone who could maybe reconcile the community having that sort of religious figure in their lives, who doesn't have the power that they once had, but is somebody that can still be benign and be kind of a positive influence, and who keeps hold some of those traditions that were so important to the kind of culture and fabric of the society without imposing the doctrine. So I felt like he was maybe an example of a more contemporary type of, religious figure in Ireland, who could like move on with the times and embrace all the societal changes, and mean that people like, say, my parents' generation didn't have to completely turn their back on the church because he kind of made it possible for everybody. And there's a really famous priest in Ireland called Father Brian Darcy, who's sort of like a celebrity priest. He's kind of a rock and roll priest, and I mean, he was really amazing in the sense that he always stood up to the church in terms of understanding what was the right side to be on in terms of a lot of the challenges that people had with the church being so old-fashioned and conservative and oppressive. And I went to a funeral where he was hosting, and I always dreaded going to any kind of church masses. I hated that I could still remember all the responses, and I still remembered all the prayers, and I hated all the standing up, and the whole thing made me so uncomfortable as an adult. And I remembered Father Darcy stood up that day in the chapel, and he said that he knew there were a lot of people who felt that way about coming into the chapel, and he didn't want that to be a barrier to them being able to honor the person who was passing. And he said, so just think about it in terms of it's a language, it's a code. And when I say things like we raise our hearts up to the Lord, in your mind you just think we raise our hearts up to the light, and just fill in your own words that you feel okay about, and then we can all be here together. And I just so I guess Father Donal felt like that sort of priest to me, that he was somebody who could maybe offer a kind of a hand across the the divide. But none of this was explicit to me at all in the writing. It was only later when people were saying to me like, oh, Father Donal, he's such a nice priest, and you give out so much about the church. The minute I saw a priest coming up, I thought, oh, he's going to be the villain. And then it just got me thinking afterwards about why he turned into such a kind of a positive character. Yeah, it's a strange thing. I think if I'd been told at the beginning I was going to write a nice priest, I would have refused to do it. So it's just maybe sometimes your subconscious tricks you into something else.
That's fascinating, actually. That's really fascinating. So thinking about the novel and the representation of mothers and the sort of gender politics of Ireland. Now, you start with the representation of Maeve. She already has mental health issues before she becomes a mother. So I'm wondering how much are these kind of social pressures and cultural pressures about mothering and about gender a part of her decision, her depression and her decision to commit suicide, and how much are they separate from that for you? Or why did you choose to sort of see her separately from her marriage and her children first? Can you talk more about that?
Well, I suppose where the kind of external influence bit came in for me was that, as you say, like Maeve had always had things that she struggled with throughout her life from when she was an adolescent in Brooklyn before she moved to Ireland. But I think where that kind of external kind of cultural impact comes in is in the sense that once she became a kind of a mother in Ireland, culturally around her, she would have been expected to make that her absolute priority, mother first, woman second. And, any kind of internal struggle she might have had would have been way down the list in terms of what people would have expected to be her priority. And, there's a moment in the novel where she's writing in her journal, and she says something like, what a mother says would never end up in the newspaper because once your kids are showing up at school and they're well fed and their school uniforms are clean and their homework gets done, then everything must be fine. That in terms of her ability to seem like she was functioning and that everything was okay, it was all filtered through how successfully she was performing her role as a mother. So I think Maeve would have always struggled, with the problems that she had. But I think that sort of just expectation of her kind of trying to live up to this iconic mother figure, that was so prevalent in Ireland, would have just made it even more difficult for her to have a dialogue about anything else that she might need, because she's not supposed to have needs or things that she's prioritizing over her family. So I think it just made it even more difficult for her to find a voice for what she was experiencing and a way to find help.
And her children have to process that as well. They have to reconsider their relationship to their mother. But what I found really interesting is how you looked at each of them separately and you sort of juxtaposed different experiences and different relationships that they had with their mother and different forms of grief and their individual ways of processing this. Was this a part of your intention for the novel when you started? How did this emerge, this kind of structure?
Well, I suppose something that definitely informed that element is just on a very practical level. I mean, I'm the youngest of 6 children. And sometimes when I talk to my siblings about our parents or memories I have of our childhood or my understanding of family dynamics, and talk to one of my sisters about it, it's like we've had 2 completely different upbringings. So on one level, we've obviously pretty much had the same experience of growing up in our family, but on another, the way that people write the narrative of their own lives and their own place in a family and the kind of power dynamics in the family are just, are so vastly different. And so it was really important to me to try and capture that in terms of the children, that living with a mother who was suffering the way she was, and also living with a father who was dealing with a mother, and their relationship would have impacted all of the children so differently. And the kind of legacy of the relationship that they had with Maeve, would have unfolded differently for all of them. So I think it was really important for me. And it sort of was a thing that rang through for the whole novel for me, was about that idea of like personal truth and not necessarily aligning with what are universally accepted truths. So while many, many, many mothers might read Maeve's experience and find it really struggle to understand some of the choices she made, I guess the point was that it was her authentic, true self, that made those choices. And I think in all our areas of life, in big ways and small, we have to go on those journeys sometimes of accepting that the thing that's right for us doesn't necessarily click with maybe what our families expected of us or what society expects of us. And that's how we kind of find our, make peace with ourselves, when we're kind of able to own, where our personal truths don't align up. And so it was really important to me that the children all had their own sort of very specific relationship with her, and that their grief and their frustration and their disappointment and their love of her and their joy of her would sort of manifest itself in different ways.
And with your representation of Murtagh, he obviously loves her, and you get how much he loves her. I found him so frustrating. I wish he would talk to her more. I wish he would confront the depression. I wish he would, handle it differently. I wonder how you saw him.
Well, it's so interesting you say that, because in the first draft I wrote of the novel, Murtagh was so good at handling Maeve that I had to rewrite him, because it just felt inauthentic for the time, because I loved him so much. I love Murtagh, and I wanted him to be the best of men and be really brilliant and be so supportive of her, and for his love to manifest itself in the most helpful way. But it just wasn't right. It didn't ring true at all. I think for a man of his generation and a man of that time, when there was so little dialogue about mental health, when there would have been no discussion about postnatal depression or any of the things that they might have been dealing with, I couldn't make him be better than the time that he was set in. And so, I mean, I'd like to think that, as you follow Murtagh's story along, you see him waking up to the reality of what Maeve might have needed from him, and that he's able to kind of retrospectively see, maybe if I had done this, or maybe if I had done that, things might have been different, and maybe I should have pushed this more, but that he could only do at the time what he was capable of. And I think that's kind of a hard lesson that we all learn, is not sort of condemning our younger selves for not having the knowledge that those experiences that we lived through gave us in later life. That we all kind of have to go through that. And thankfully, most of us don't learn it in such a brutal way as Murtagh did. But I had to sort of let him not know how to cope. And, that there's a scene early on in the novel, pretty early on, where Maeve tries to explain to him some of the things that have happened to her, when she was younger in America. And he's so obtuse about it. And it's like you can just see him not really taking it in with the gravitas that he needs to, that, and that sort of sets them off on the part. But he just didn't have the kind of emotional bandwidth to really process it all. So I had to resist.
That's fascinating. The fact that you had to sort of go back and edit the characters to match the context that's really interesting. Yeah. Shall we open this up to a larger audience and questions from everyone? Because I feel I've taken more than enough time here to ask my questions. If anyone wants to put something on.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Yeah, sure, please do.
So I love the book. I gave it 9 3/4 out of 10. I took away a quarter of a mark for one particular thing, and that was why did you change the spelling of all the Irish names to make them more anglicised?
Well, first of all, I haven't really, because I found alternate Irish spellings for the names. So Sive, which I know would be Sadhbh if we were to go that route, I made myself feel better because John B. Keane wrote his Sive at Sive. So I've gone on a long night of the soul with all of these Irish spellings, and like the Dylan version, the Dillon was sort of like the Celtic Dylan, and so I did keep them all as having Irish spellings, but just picked a version of them that was a little bit easier for people to process. I mean, in the first draft, I had the Sadhbh Sive, and I so stubbornly, I kept it for so long, and literally every single person, even Irish people who were reading it, were going, "Hold on, is this girl called Sad?" And I was, okay, no, I actually, I'm going to have to compromise a little bit. But yeah, but Sive was the big one. But then I thought, if John B. Keane can do it, so can I.
Fair enough.
Sorry, I lost that mark.
Well, look, it's the tiniest thing. I really did enjoy it. I did like it.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to discussing it more in our class tomorrow with Emily. But yeah, I mean, so much so that I went and I bought another one of your books today. So I'm going to go back and read that one next.
Well, if it makes you feel better, you were the exact person I was thinking of when I stuck up for those Irish names.
No, I did that. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Ken.
Emma has a question. Emma?
Hi. Yeah, so from that extract you read us at the start, I mean, first of all, I want a robe embroidered with a murmuration of starlings and want to know where I can get me one of those. But it made me think there was such a richness to your descriptive detail that I thought was beautiful. There were so many textures and colours, even in such a short extract. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit from a process perspective about working with the senses and giving the reader that detail so that they can sort of bring that world to life as they're reading.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I think it is definitely a stylistic choice. I mean, some people really are, find kind of descriptive passages hard work. I think for me, I tend to sometimes overcook it a bit, and then I go back and I compress it and think about what's the little authentic detail that gives this life and energy. And when I was I have an amazing writing mentor called Michelle Roberts, and she said 2 things to me that I think about all of the time when I'm writing. And the first is that there's a reason why in art galleries you only have 1 painting on each wall. And that it really, I think about that a lot when I'm sort of painting these sort of wordy pictures and going, okay, if I give too much here, then it'll just become overwhelming. And she would just say, just trust that you've got 1 good image, just write 1 really good one, and then the rest weakens it. So that's the first thing. And the second part is that in terms of characters and the details around characters, you just have to know your characters if they were walking down the street. So how would I recognize my Maeve if I saw her in a coffee shop? What's the thing that would mean you would clock her straight away and go, that she's mine? And they're 2 really simple things, but they've really been a guiding light for me in terms of those characters. And I do think that especially when you're introducing characters for the first time, like a grounding physical sensory detail that makes them instantly a material thing goes a long way. I used to go to the interior first because it's where I'm kind of most invested. So I'd immediately start thinking about their interior world. So I had to train myself to land them on the page first, and to land the setting and the room and the place so that people have a kind of feel an anchor into the book. And then you can kind of, do the dialogue or, the action or whatever, give them behaviors. But I think it is really important, those sort of physical details. Yeah, but I have to sort of resist doing too much of it.
Grace has a question next.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you focus a lot on Irish culture, is that what you said? Yeah, so I wanted to know how you can make sure that you engage with other cultures, because I always write about like different cultural aspects and stuff, but without dishonoring them, and like how to make sure that you stay honoring the culture, if that makes sense.
Do you mean in terms of introducing other cultures apart from the Irish culture when I'm setting a book there?
Yeah, so like if you were writing about, for example, American culture, I don't know if you know anything about like American culture, like, if you're from America, but yeah, how would you, or Spanish culture, how do you make sure you're honoring?
Yeah, well, I think this is so important now, and I mean, I'm obviously Irish, so I felt really comfortable, you know, setting, you know, the book in Ireland, and thinking about how I could lean into what are actually traditional elements of Irish culture without it tipping over into stereotype. You know, I felt like I could walk that line, and I think sometimes that's what's really difficult about when you're introducing, you know, a culture that you don't have that sense of nuance with. I think this is so important, you know, that you're not kind of writing about people based on ideas that you've inherited, and that, you know, you really take the time to really research and understand the subtleties, and that you're not sort of just adopting assumed ideas about a culture outside of your own. And one of my characters in the book, Fionn, that we spoke about, is mixed race, and he's from he had a Jamaican dad and a mum who was Irish, and so he'd grown up in Birmingham but been really immersed in his Irish culture from his mum. And so I spent a lot of time, you know, really thinking about how, you know, and reading and trying to understand what his experience would have been, and how his mum might have introduced Ireland to him while he was living in Birmingham, and how he might have connected, you know, with his father's roots. And, you know, I think that even though someone might, he obviously, well, he's not, I mean, it's not obvious to you because you haven't read it yet, but he's not like a major character. But I really spend a lot of time really trying to think about what would be the authentic details, and that I just think it's about not making kind of lazy assumptions. And I think you really have to like look to own voices, you know, to help you make those decisions, and to read literature from people who live and are immersed in that culture, so that you're hearing it directly from the people, you know, who are from there, as opposed to, you know, an American writing about what they think it might be like to live in Scandinavia, or, you know, an Irish person writing about what they think it might be like to live in the Caribbean. You know, I think you have to get back to the own voices, and why it's so important that people are taking seriously this quest for more diversity in publishing and more diversity in writing, so that we get to hear the real experiences and not just adopted, you know, experiences. Does that help at all? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really am.
Thank you.
Jess has a question.
I just love the book, and I mean, I absolutely loved the fact that it represented that real struggle between sense of self versus that identity of mother that's kind of imposed upon you beyond having the kids, right? And everything that goes with it, and the pressure and the guilt and the feeling of kind of losing yourself. But of course, it was kind of completely devastating at the same time, because she doesn't survive it, right? It's not really a spoiler, because obviously that's the kind of opening chapter. And I just wondered, was that always the kind of starting point for the book? Was there ever a kind of alternative where she did kind of survive those struggles?
I know. I mean, and it's sort of an interesting thing, because first of all, gosh, I would hate if I ever thought anyone thought I was ever suggesting that what she did was the only way to cope, or the right thing to do. You know, I think it felt to Maeve like the right thing for her, which is a very different thing from, you know, obviously other women who might be experiencing, you know, similar experiences, thinking that they had no other outlet or no other options. What might surprise people to understand about the way I wrote the book is that I actually wrote it in the exact way that you read it. So I wrote that first chapter where we see Maeve taking her own life, and I had no idea what had happened at that point. I had this instinct about Murta. He came to me first. He was the very first character. I could see him in that hallway. I felt like I knew exactly who he was, that he was this, you know, stoic Irish father. I had this vision of him kind of in the future, bringing all his adult children home together and speaking to them a truth that would have this massive impact on their lives. but that was all I had. And then I sat down and I wrote that first chapter, and all I had going in was, you know, Murta in the hallway. I thought, maybe is this the scene where he's going to invite his children home? I don't know, but I started writing it, and then this whole story, this whole moment with Maeve evolved. And then I sat back and I just thought, oh my goodness, like, how has this happened? What, you know, how has this woman ended up here? And so I took them back to the 1970s, Maeve and Murta with me for the first time, and I basically wrote up to that moment to work out, you know, what had happened. And then kind of got there and went, gosh, so what's going to happen now? And then wrote, you know, forward from there to kind of get to present time. So I think if someone had said to me before I started, oh, would you like to write a novel that deals with this, you know, mother and this woman who takes her own life at the start of the book, and then we, you know, as time goes on, we understand all her, you know, struggles with her mental health, and I would have thought, like, no, I don't, you know, I can't imagine telling that story. And I would have, you know, been really nervous about it, but it sort of happened by accident. Because it sort of all just revealed itself to me in the course of the writing. And I think that's something that I often say to people now who say they have this instinct that they'd like to write, but they don't know what this story would be, or they can't work out like how an idea they have would unfold, or they think, oh, but I mean, I have an idea, but I could write it in like 400 words. So how do I turn that into, you know, 100,000 words? And I always say to them that it's actually only the act of creativity itself, when you create the opportunity for it, that these things reveal themselves to you. And I know it sounds a bit woo-woo, and it's actually the opposite of that, because it's just total discipline. You know, if you sit down and you actually commit to the actual act of, you know, writing on a page or typing, then it just sort of happens. Like, you kind of start generating a story, and it just keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. So it would have been so difficult to sit. I could never, ever, ever have sat down and plotted out this book and thought, oh, I'm going to address all of these things. I would have been totally intimidated by it. It's only because it kind of crept up on me that I ever managed to do it at all.
Well, it is wonderfully done. I mean, I think I was so devastated by it because of how beautiful it is, and because of how well it's written, and because of how, you know, relatable it is, the kind of struggles that she's going through.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to hear it.
Helen, can I come back in? Another question, another point.
Sure.
So I grew up in rural Ireland in the late 70s and the 80s. So I found it was a mirror image. I assume that you must be around my age, but I won't dare question that. But your accuracy to what was on the TV and to the timeline of events throughout the novel was, you know, it was pinpoint. Did you remember those points yourself from life in Ireland, or were they things that you had to go back and research? And how important were they in your timeline?
Well, I suppose a lot of it was sort of instinct and just from my own memory, but then I really sort of fact check myself. And you go through this amazingly painful process just before you go to print, where they get a copy editor to go through and interrogate all of the facts in the book. So credit where credit is due. You have this, you know, experience where you have somebody literally going through and annotating your manuscript, going, you know, did the Boomtown Rats really release this in January 1979? Because actually, you know, and you start off replying to these comments at the beginning going, thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. Yes, I have confirmed that. And by the end of it, you're like, he's wearing a jumper even though it's summer because he likes wearing layers, okay? You know, but it does sort of make you really, you know, scrupulous to make sure that you're not relying too much, you know, on your memory. So I'm glad you think that they felt authentic. I mean, some things just never leave you, like, you know, the RT Guide Christmas bumper special, you know, things like that will stay with you forever. But I did have to go back and sort of just make sure that, especially things around anything that's linked to a definite date, is so dangerous, you know, in terms of, was that film out, was that TV show on? Like, people will tell you all sorts of things. Like in my first book, it went to print with a song in it that I had said somebody was singing on, but actually the version that was released at that point was just an instrumental, and they put the vocals down later. You know, this man wrote to me from America to tell me because he was so upset about it, you know. So it's so easy to get those things wrong that yeah, but I'm glad you think that I got away with it anyway. If there's any,
I spent a good hour yesterday looking at old episodes of Bosco, the Plodsters, Flaherty's Garden. I still have a theme tune in my head. So, that was a trip down memory lane that I never thought I'd go down.
Yeah. Oh, that's so nice. Bosco was my first love, so I have to credit where credit is due.
He raised many a child in Ireland.
Yeah.
I heard you speak before about your relationship to the island, but I'm not sure everyone here has. Can you talk more about your decision to set the novel on this island, and why it's important to this family, how it shapes their relationship, and how at times they're more distant from, because of what happens on this island, they then feel more distance from it, and several of the family members leave. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, the island is heavily inspired by a real island in Ireland called Inisheer, which is the smallest of the Aran Islands off the west coast of Galway. I mean, it's so heavily inspired by it that at home when people are talking about the book, they just always call it Inisheer. They don't even try and hang on to the fictional title of it. But when but I made a really definite decision when I knew I wanted to set it on, effectively that island. Because I'd spent my summers there as a teenager going to the Gaeltacht, which sounds like this sort of, like crazy, sort of strange summer camp to the outside world, which I guess it is, but it's way more fun than the brochure would imply, because teenagers basically go off for 3 weeks and you only speak Irish and you learn Irish dancing and, Irish sports, and it's incredible. I mean, so for me, like where I went to the one in Inisheer, you've got 150 teenagers who are being sort of let free for the first time away from their families, and all the boys live on one side of the island up behind the castle, and the girls all live on the other side of the island, and they go to these céilís at night time, and then they separate, and are marched back to their houses, and it's sort of this incredible liberating thing that you go away and have this incredible experience, and it's sort of just a byproduct that you get immersed in your kind of Irish culture. And so it was a really formative part of my adolescence, going away and being kind of independent, and that I think of as just so significant in terms of my development as a person, and I think even as a writer, because it was where I first began to sort of think of myself as an individual outside of my family unit. It was an incredible thing. But having said all that, it's so, mythologized in my memory. And even though I've gone back loads as an adult, I just didn't want to get really fixated on, if they were to leave their house and they were walking to the boatyard, would they have gotten there by that time? And where is the castle exactly in relation to the shipwreck? And, it felt like I knew that I would get really hung up on making sure that all the technicalities were so accurate that it would stop the flow of the writing, and that it would keep being a thing I would run up against, because, I would go, where am I putting this? Oh, is that right? Looking at maps and street maps, all those things I just think are for me, they're such barriers to me being able to work out what the story is. So I decided at the very beginning that I was going to just like be heavily inspired by that island, but name it as something else, and then I could take kind of creative license and use it to support the story. And I think, islands are a great gift to writers, because automatically there's kind of a metaphor there for their kind of disconnection from the mainstream, disconnection from the mainland. And there's something really devastating about the fact that, the sea that was so important to them and so integral to their happiness is the thing that took their mother. And so that felt, really powerful to me, that they were living with this constant reminder all the time of how Maeve died. And so it became a kind of a physical thing that they could react to. And as I was thinking about how I was going to show how their relationship with home was evolving over time, I could let that manifest in how they felt about going back to the island and what it kind of represented to them. So yeah, I think islands are brilliant for writers. Just if you're in doubt, if anyone's writing a book and you don't know where to put it on an island. It's a great gift to yourself. You can just use it in so many ways.
I love how, for Maeve, the characterization of Maeve, you kind of intersperse the narrative with her diaries and her letters, and then letters become so important after she's died to her relationship to her children and what she's left them. Can you say more about your decision to use letters and diaries?
Oh, well, I suppose I'm a great believer in the power of letter writing as that in terms of how it enables people to access their subconscious and their interior world. I mean, my whole first book, the first novel, was really like a love letter to letter writing, and I always encourage people now to kind of revive that as a thing. And sometimes people say, oh, you know, I wouldn't know what to say, and I couldn't write a letter now. And again, similar, in a very similar way to creative writing, like what you need to say to someone in a letter only reveals itself to you when you start writing the letter, and it's endlessly surprising, you know, what it unfolds. And so I think I really wanted to give Maeve that tool in her life for her to help her to have a kind of an understanding of herself, and for us to have that juxtaposition then between how she was being perceived to the outside world and how she was acting and performing in this incredible way as their mother, but how that kind of juxtaposed with how she was really feeling inside. So I think yeah, it's an amazing way to kind of access a character's interior, but I think it's an amazing thing for all of us to do in our lives, you know, to write and like to keep a journal or to write letters and just sort of see what reveals itself to you. There's a like a famous writing workshop exercise that, you know, I love doing with creative writers, especially if they've never written before, and you basically just set a timer for, you know, 2 minutes, and you tell them that they have to keep writing. They call it automatic writing, but, you know, just keep writing. You can't stop writing, but every sentence has to begin with I remember, I remember, I remember, I remember, I remember. And afterwards, they're all like, without exception, they're always totally shocked by the things that have bubbled up to the surface when they've given themselves that kind of permission to do that process. It's always so moving, the things that people find are waiting for them to kind of rediscover. So I think by sort of letting myself do that in a kind of a fictional way with Maeve, it helped me to kind of uncover some of the things that she was thinking about. I know I talk about them like they're real people. It probably sounds a bit mad, but they've kind of become like real people to me now.
Of course they do. I mean, they're very full characters. They're all very full characters. It's amazing. Jess has a question that I think is a really good question to end on, actually. And she said, I'd love to know what Helen's planning for her next book. And Helen is writing a PhD at the same time that she's writing her next book, or with part of her next book is her PhD, if I understand that.
Well, the scary thing is that the third book isn't going to be the PhD book. I have to kind of, you know, bank that one, like, and then sort of start the PhD novel. So the book, oh my goodness, I wish I had an easy answer for this, because I actually had such a crisis of confidence with the third book. I think, I mean, the first book, obviously, you know, I kind of wrote, like I said, we're trying to work out how to write a book, not really thinking ever about it being published, or, you know, really thinking I would ever be talking about it in the world or anything. You know, it felt like a really private experience. And people who want to get published, who haven't been published yet, don't believe writers when they say this, but you will never have such a perfect writing experience as you will have when you write without knowing it's going anywhere. It completely changes your whole attitude about your work and how you approach it. You can never get back that sort of spirit of innocence and experimentation that you bring to the page when you think no one will ever read it. It's just one of those things. But so, you know, and that's why so many people, you often hear writers talking about like second novel syndrome, and then becoming really freaked out by the process of writing with this new lens of knowing that it will get read. It can be so debilitating. But weirdly, for me with the second novel, that didn't affect me as much. I think that first chapter from this book, sort of, it just, because it kind of came out sort of almost fully formed and with a question for me to answer, and it gave me the impetus to kind of keep moving. And then I made a terrible error with my third book, where I sat down and really tried to think about it before I started writing it, because I became really freaked out that the kind of premise I had didn't have any legs. And I broke all my own rules about my few rules that I have, which are pretty much just don't look back, just keep going forward. But I really got the wobbles about the third book after I'd written the first couple of chapters and was like, oh no, I don't think this is going to happen. And then stupidly went back and rewrote the beginning, I think like 10 times. This is such a bad idea. Nobody do this, like it's so bad. So by the time, so I wasted months basically fretting about whether or not my setup was going to work, because I was really chasing that experience I'd had with, you know, with the first book and with the most recent one, where in both cases, and I realize now this was a miracle, I kind of wrote the first chapters and they never really changed. They were like the foundations for the books. I knew exactly what they were. So later on, even when things were kind of difficult, like I always knew what it was. So by not having that sort of what I felt was like my banked beginning, and this, you know, sense of the voice of it, I just totally lost it. So I've kind of found my way back now, sort of. But I definitely have relearned that lesson about just keep going. And, you know, my writing mentor, Michelle, loves talking to me about negative capability, which I'm sure she's written an amazing memoir this year actually called Negative Capability. And it's the most incredible book about the writerly life that I really recommend to everybody. And she's like 13 novels down the road. But she thinks that, you know, when we find ourselves in these really difficult situations with our work, it's because we're accessing something that's actually really important, and that, you know, the really brilliant people aren't afraid to live in that state of unknowing. That if you're comfortable to write without being confident that it's the right thing, or without being sure where it's going, and you're happy to just follow the thread, then, you know, you will write your way through the process. But often what happens, and why they call it writer's block, is people panic because they don't know the answer. And that's definitely what happened to me, you know, with the writing of this. Because I lost my nerve with the premise, I couldn't sit in that state of unknowing. It made me too anxious, and it just, I found it so hard to get back. So that's a long way of saying, don't get it right, get it written, and just keep going. And don't be afraid to write when you don't know what you're doing.
This is such valuable advice for everyone. It really is. You're amazing. You really are amazing as a scholar and a writer. And I'm just so grateful that you came and had this interview with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here and to have had all your amazing questions. And I'm so grateful that you're considering the book on the syllabus, and I can't wait to hear what people have to say about it. Yeah.
Well, we loved it. So yeah, I guess this kind of wraps up our session. Everyone is writing in. Thank you so much for being candid and for a fascinating conversation. And it was so interesting. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope to see you all in real life soon, hopefully.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you, Helen.